I'm going to reference the brilliant work of Michael Stevens of Vsauce again. No doubt it will happen many more times. If you haven't checked out his YouTube channel yet, please do. I don't even mind if you stop listening to this podcast to do so. So in this episode, Michael works with neurobiologist Moran Cerf, who follows in the work of Benjamin Libet, and argues that when we make decisions, we first do so subconsciously, and our consciousness only interprets that decision rather than actively making it. So in this episode, participants would push a button while wearing an electrode cap that would read their brain activity. Now, the instructions were simple. It's just whenever you want, just push one of two buttons. But if the button lights up, don't push it. And for a while, the participants would just push a button whenever they felt like it. But behind the scenes, a computer was analyzing their brain activity, and eventually it would predict when the participant would push the button, before even the participant was aware that they were going to push it. So you can see this participant starting to reach for the button, and then it lights up. Or maybe their fingers twitch in anticipation, or sometimes there's no physical motion at all. But their frustration is building as they feel like the button lights up right before they decide to press it, at least most of the time. So the most obvious implication of this research is that we aren't consciously deciding to press the button. Instead, we are becoming consciously aware of a decision that has already been made subconsciously, and the algorithm was able to detect that subconscious decision and prematurely light up the button. And then, of course, we're expected to extrapolate from this experiment to the idea that all conscious decisions aren't really decisions at all, just awareness of decisions that have already been made by our subconscious without our input. Now, this work doesn't definitively kill the concept of free will all by itself, but it should at least act as a speed bump that forces us to question our assumptions a little bit. Does free will really exist? To help us think through this, let's consider an example. Suppose I want to eat more salads. Which of these is most accurate? Can I choose 1, to eat a salad for lunch every day? Or is it 2, that I can only learn to choose salads over hamburgers more frequently? Or 3, I can't even do that. Maybe I either want to eat salads or I don't. And if I don't want to eat salads, then I can't make myself want to eat salads. I'm going to claim that in order for free will to exist, the only possible answer in our example is number 1. In order to have free will, in this case over the choice of eating salads, I need to be able to choose to eat a salad in the moment, every moment that I want to. If this is not completely true, then free will doesn't exist, or at least it's not as impactful as we would like to believe. And this suggests 2 qualities that are necessary for free will as we typically interpret it. The first is time, that is, the delay between the will to take some action and the act of doing the thing. This is relevant. I'm not going to claim a specific time threshold, but to be necessarily vague, I will claim that for any action to be guided solely by free will, the action must follow immediately from the will, if that is what is desired. For example, if I want to get up off the couch right now and go to the gym right now, but it takes 15 minutes to convince myself before I finally do it, then this is a failure of free will. Now, it's fine if I wanted to get up in 15 minutes, but if I wanted to get up right now and I was unable to do so, then free will was not sufficient to get me to the gym. Now, you'll notice the exact wording I used here is not that I didn't have the will to go to the gym, but that free will wasn't sufficient. This does require a bit of clarification. Let's say perhaps that I really don't like exercise. So maybe in addition to requiring free will to get myself to the gym, I need some additional help, for example from a cattle prod. Now, if we define free will in such a way that free will exists but is not sufficient for some actions, then perhaps I can have free will and still not do very much with it. If you want to use that definition of free will, you may do so. I choose not to, as it tends to render it fairly insignificant. If free will can't actually let me use my will to, say, do stuff like go to the gym, even without any external inhibitions, like house arrest or incapacitation, then free will is inherently very limited, and I would then consider it not terribly interesting to think about. So for my definition of free will, I must be able to use my free will to do whatever I want, provided there's no external limitation. And we can also consider whether free will affects only our actions or whether it can govern our thoughts and feelings as well. Let's consider throwing a ball as an action. As long as nothing external impedes me, does my free will let me throw a ball? Am I free to choose to throw the ball or to not throw it? You could argue that I am. But what about less tangible things? For example, optimism. Optimism is not an action. It could be considered a mental state. So you may claim, well, free will doesn't necessarily apply to our mental state. It only applies to our actions, like throwing a ball. But if that's true, then could my mental state also impair my ability to act? If I'm really depressed, will I be so unmotivated that I won't be able to throw that ball even if I want to? And if so, does free will then really enable me to throw that ball? No, I argue that for free will to have any significant meaning, it must apply both to our mind and our actions. Okay, so that was a long tangent, but anyways, we have mentioned that time is the first important feature of free will. That is, whatever action I'm interested in must follow immediately from the will for that action, again, as long as there are no external limitations. But immediacy is not the only quality. Free will also requires a guaranteed match between the will and the action. I may have gotten to the gym 15 minutes late, but I still got there, so what's the harm? But what if we analyze my behavior for a few weeks? We might see that I wanted to go to the gym 10 times, but I only managed to get myself up off the couch 7 times. The other 3 times, my will alone was not sufficient. When I failed to get to the gym, it was purely due to a failure of will. If that's the case, then I claim that I do not really have free will, at least when it comes to motivating myself to do stuff, like go to the gym. Now, we all probably realize that, as humans, we're very conflicted a lot. So maybe I do want to go to the gym, but I also want to sit on the couch and eat ice cream. So maybe those 3 times when I failed to make it to the gym, I didn't actually want to go hard enough. But this doesn't solve our conundrum. If I claim that my will was to exercise, shouldn't I also claim that my will was to sit and eat? And if I permit myself more than one will, then eventually all of my actions just become some amalgamation of whatever each part of me wanted to do in the moment, but which it certainly seems like I don't have any control over. So again, my second claim is that any action governed solely by free will cannot involve a chance for success. Success must be guaranteed, excepting, of course, any of those pesky external limitations. If there is a chance of failure, you're not actually free to do the thing. Let's consider eating that salad again. If there's a chance that I will accidentally order a hamburger in any situation in which I want to order a salad, then I don't really have the freedom to order a salad in that moment. I simply have the freedom to try to order a salad. If this is a bit abstract, we can consider a more tangible example. Can I flap my arms and fly to the moon? I am free to try. I can try in private. I can try in public. I can try in the grocery store, in the woods, in the basement. No government will tell me I can't. Probably. There's no bandits that will threaten me to stop flapping my arms. But I am not actually free to flap my arms and fly to the moon, because I can't actually do it. We would not say I have the freedom to flap my arms and fly to the moon, even though I can try as much as I like. Of course, flapping to the moon is physically impossible under present conditions. What if instead I am presented with a kitchen full of ingredients and tasked with cooking a souffle? Even if I am not trained to do so, it's possible that I could get lucky and successfully create a souffle. The chance of doing so depends on many things. My baking experience, access to recipes, and simply knowing what the hell a souffle is. I'm not an expert in these matters. But unlike flapping to the moon, here there is a chance for success. Would you say then that I have the freedom to make a souffle? Again, because success is not guaranteed, I would claim no. So again, you might say that I am free to try to make a souffle, and this is true, but the freedom to make a souffle is not the same as the freedom to try to make a souffle. just as you would not say that you're free to try to exert free will. The phrase simply doesn't make sense. Similarly, I claim that we do not have the freedom to choose to eat the salad at any given meal unless we can do so at every meal, should we decide we want to. Speaking of optimism again as a mental state, I suspect many of us believe that we can't necessarily choose to be more optimistic in every moment. And I agree. Many of us, though, perhaps believe that we can become more optimistic over time. I still agree, but I don't consider this to be free will, because I don't think we're actually free to decide that we want to become more optimistic. If we want to become more optimistic, we will seek opportunities to do so. And if we don't want to become more optimistic, we won't. But we don't get to choose whether or not we want to become more optimistic. Either we have that drive or we don't. Will is not involved. But I think a lot of the times people confuse free will with the capacity for change. It is certainly possible for people to change. And as a result, I think that we can indeed become more optimistic over time. Maybe I don't want to be more optimistic now, but there's a chance that in the future I will want to be a more optimistic person. But that change is not necessarily governed by free will. The changes that result in my drive to become more optimistic over time, I argue these come from the environment, not from our will. And that's why immediacy is so important in free will, because if we allow the passage of time, then any other factor, like our environment, can and will influence our decisions. Maybe I happen to be attending a seminar that's discussing personal growth, and someone just says something that triggers me to want to be a more optimistic person. Maybe some traumatic circumstance in my life pushes me into a place where I decide that hope and optimism are my best chance at long-term relief. But I don't get to choose this. If I don't already want to be optimistic, the only thing that can make me change my mind is some external stimulus. Again, suppose you don't want to be optimistic. You believe it's stupid or impossible or, whatever. There's other things you're worried about. Ask yourself, is it possible for you to want to become someone who wants optimism? Again, this question doesn't even make sense. You either want optimism or you don't. Your will has nothing to do with it. If we take a mechanistic view of the universe, then to the best of our knowledge, everything we observe, matter and energy, obeys causality. That is, if we know the conditions of a system, we can predict the future conditions of that system. Consider a billiard table and balls. With sufficient knowledge of the positions, masses, table friction, and force vectors by which one strikes the cue ball, we could theoretically predict the final positions of all the other balls as they bounce off of each other and off of the table bumpers and whatnot. If we follow causality to its extreme conclusion, then even our bodies and our minds follow the laws of causality. By knowing the existing conditions, such as our genetics, our history, and so on, we can predict exactly what we'll do and even how we'll think. Of course, the information and computing power needed to actually perform such a prediction are likely impractical to ever create in reality. But the idea is nonetheless valid that, unless causality has exceptions, then everything about us is completely predicated on past events, hence no free will. While some concepts within quantum mechanics bring causality into question, at this time there is not to my knowledge any evidence that our thoughts directly influence quantum states of matter, though I know there are some alternative viewpoints. I'm looking at you, microtubule people. But I will happily revise my viewpoint in the light of any new information. Now, the idea that free will doesn't exist can be uncomfortable for many reasons. First, the idea can present a threat to our individual sense of agency. We all have hopes and dreams, aspirations. To be told that we don't have free will is to remove our sense of accomplishment permanently. More so than anything else, our bodies, our families, careers, etc., our will is what makes us feel human. Secondly, without free will, morality can admittedly become a bit muddy. If you commit murder and you have free will, I can feel justified in punishing you. If you lack free will, however, punishment is a bit more questionable. It can't feel as satisfying or just. I will point out that despite this possible moral conundrum, I still think that punishment is very much needed as a deterrent for crime, whether free will exists or not. And in fact, those systems of punishment deter crime regardless of whether that crime is performed by choice, that is, by free will, or by the inevitable outcome of one's environment, that is, by external factors. Third, the absence of free will could possibly be incompatible with some religious beliefs. I'm not an expert in religion, so I can't comment definitively on whether or not such a concern is valid, but I can see it as a possibility. I won't discuss this further, both because of my lack of expertise and because this could be a contentious issue, and we have plenty of other contentious things to talk about instead. Of course, these three justifications at our discomfort at dismissing free will most certainly do not prove its existence, but they do explain the visceral attachment that we have to the idea of free will, whether it ultimately exists or not. For the vast majority of intents and purposes, though, I still think we should behave as if free will does exist. Society kind of demands it. In our conscious experience, it feels like we have free will. And for most practical causes, like paying the mortgage, helping your grandfather figure out how to send pictures in a text message, eating tacos, etc., the subtleties of existence, or lack thereof, of free will, is hardly relevant. So if we should go so far as to behave as if free will exists, even when it might not, then why does it matter if it exists or not? Well, our beliefs do have some really important and fundamental implications on our perspective. If free will doesn't exist, then compassion for others, at least in my mind, is a logical conclusion. Ultimately, of course, your thoughts on free will should ideally be based on what you believe is true, rather than what you think is best for us. And hopefully I've encouraged you to at least question the existence of free will. But let's consider an example. If I believe free will exists, then when someone causes harm to others, I can despise that person. They should have known better. Maybe they should suffer for the harm they've caused. If, however, I don't believe in free will, then the criminal is only doing what they are able to. They didn't know better and couldn't have done any better, at least not in that moment. When someone causes harm, I think it's generally okay to stop them from doing it again. But it's not okay to persecute them solely as punishment. It's not okay to hate them for who they are or what they've done. And a lack of free will makes this viewpoint a lot easier to swallow. That change in perspective alone, I think, is worth pursuing, whether you believe in free will or not.